Okay, let's go over wilderness first aid. So just like sudden illness, we're going to classify a lot of different skills that we haven't talked about up until this point into wilderness first aid, because not only can you do these in day-to-day situations, but they're also really important for wilderness first aid situations. So we've already talked about bleeding quite a bit, so I will talk a little bit about it because it is a key concern, because classify wilderness first aid as when care is going to be delayed, right? We may not be able to call 911 and get EMTs to us. We may have to self-rescue, and so if somebody's bleeding out in an environment, we're going to have to get control of that and get them back to care as soon as possible. But we're really limited because care may not be able to get to us, or we may have to get to a higher point to call out. There's a bunch of different situations that fall into this. Obviously, splinting, we're going to use that. We could use it anywhere, but you're typically only going to improvise a splint or make one yourself if you're going to have to move the victim. Like if somebody got injured on campus, I'm not going to put a splint on them unless I have to move them, because I can get EMTs to them, and the EMTs are just going to take my splint off and put their own commercial splint on, which is more secure. Heat-related illness is a common wilderness-related illness, and so is cold-related. So that's why we're talking about these are not the only ones. These are just the big picture items, the big stuff, the general information. So splinting, when are we going to use it? When we're going to move a victim. That's why it's important in wilderness situations. Somebody could twist an ankle, sprain a wrist, something could happen. We're going to have to mobilize a limb or a joint, and then we're going to have to move them. Hopefully they can help out in the moving process, but sometimes you may have to splint their body in a way that they can't move without doing further injury. And that's the whole reason behind splinting, is we're trying to reduce injury and reduce pain so that in the process of moving the victim, we don't create a worse injury. So in the case of a fracture, we don't want a closed fracture becoming an open fracture. It also can provide some compression to reduce bleeding as well as swelling. So if it's a possible spine injury, we're going to splint the spine injury first before dealing with any other injuries. We want to immobilize that spine so that we don't cause a risk of them becoming paralyzed or doing damage to the central nervous system or even the peripheral nervous system. With pelvis and hip fractures, we may have to create like a longboard, a plank, or a series of limbs together that work as a plank to carry the individual out. So you have the rule of thirds. So let's just imagine a limb, right? So let's just think of our arm for a second. So we'll talk about that so you can kind of visualize what's happening. So the rule of thirds states that if the middle portion of the bone is broken, so we're talking about long bones, if the middle portion of the long bone is broken, then we go from joint to joint. If it's the upper third of the arm or the lower third, then we include the joint nearest to the injury in the splint itself. So here's an example. Let's say I break my radius and ulna, which are long bones in the forearm. I'm going to go from my elbow to my wrist if it's in the middle third of the radius and ulna. But if it's up closer to the elbow in the upper third, or the third closest to the elbow, then I'm going to include the elbow, and I'm going to take that splint all the way out to the shoulder so that the elbow is included in the splint if we're talking about rigid splints. If I went the other way, so let's say it's the third of the arm closest to the wrist that's broken, then I'm going to include the wrist in the joint, and I'm normally with wrists and ankles, you're going to use a soft splint. For the other portions of the long bones, if it's not at the end of a limb, then you're going to do more rigid splints if you have them. So splintable injuries, I mean, there's a wide range. You got closed fractures, maybe an open fracture, so we may have to pad around that open fracture as if it was a impaled object, and just to stabilize it, and then we can splint. Dislocations, sprains. So dislocations, like if I dislocated my shoulder, then we could use like a cravat, make like a triangular bandage, and use like a sling. So there are different types of splints. You have commercial splints. There are improvised splints. So commercial splints would be something like an EMT has, or something in a first aid kit that's already made. And then you have improvised splints where, like if I cut down a tree limb or use my jacket as a soft splint, that's improvised. Anatomical splints where you're going from limb to limb. So I could tape 2 fingers together. That's anatomical. I could tape a soft splint like a sling and then tie my arm to my body with another cravat. That's anatomical because it's body or arm to body. And then I could take leg to leg. That's anatomical. So those are some examples. Soft splints would be like taking my jacket off or taking a pillow or a sleeping bag and putting it around a wrist or putting it around an ankle, or even using a sling is an example of a soft splint. And then your rigid splints can be improvised or commercial, but it'd be like a tree limb that's got some padding around it. But the tree limb itself that I'm using to keep the limb in place would be a rigid splint. And in wilderness situations, they're often going to be improvised. Heat-related illnesses. So there are situations where you're out in the heat, if your body's not acclimated to it or you're dehydrated, you may have a problem thermoregulating, because if you get dehydrated, the blood becomes really viscous and thick and hard to pump around. Your body overheats really easy. And there was one other thing I wanted to talk about here. Oh yeah, so mainly with heat-related illness, we don't want to cook the organs. We don't want them to get too hot. There's 2 things that'll really mess up enzyme function in your body: high acidity and high heat. So if you've ever cooked an egg and the egg white went from clear to opaque, like where you couldn't see through it, like white, you denatured those proteins. Well, the same thing will happen in your body to enzymes, because enzymes are made up of proteins. You can denature the proteins and enzymes by getting too hot, and they won't function correctly. And you can really, once you suffer from heat illness, you're more likely to suffer from it again in the future. So dehydration makes overheating easier because your blood becomes viscous and thick, hard to pump around, heart rate increases, respiration increases. The plasma concentration in your blood is majority water. So, and your whole body, most of your body weight, 50 to 60% of a person's body weight is coming from water. So if you get dehydrated, processes don't want to function correctly. You can lose 2 quarts daily just through breathing, urinating, bowel movement, sweating. And you can only absorb 1.5 quarts an hour, but you can sweat more than you can take in. So you can sweat 2 quarts an hour, depending on the environment, and only be able to replace 1.5 quarts. So even though you're drinking an excessive amount, you may not be absorbing all of that. And then you end up getting dehydrated even after drinking water all day. So you can drink more than you can take in. One key indicator of dehydration is thirst. So once you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. And you can also monitor your urine output. So the color of your urine is a really good indicator of hydration. So you should be producing 3 to 5 clear urine 3 to 5 times if you're hydrated. Once it starts to get dark in color, what's happening is the bilirubin is building up in your urine. As you get dehydrated, you're losing fluid concentration, and the dissolved solids in there are building up, changing the color. It's mainly that bilirubin that's in the urine that you're seeing. And so if it looks dark brown, you're super dehydrated. I mean, you would feel that. But the darker color indicates hydration level. So I know the military, I think the Marine Corps used to use it as well. They would have these urine color charts next to the urinals, especially for trainees like recruits. And as they would come in and from the field or whatever, use the bathroom, they could look at their stream and look at the color chart, and it would tell them how many liters or quarts of water they should drink. So things that you drink can affect absorption. Caffeinated beverages are diuretics. Alcohol will also cause you to go to the bathroom more often. Sodas will as well. Fruit juices have a lot of dissolved sugars in them, like sodas and sugars, and so they can be harder to absorb. So the sugar increases absorption time, and diuretics increase fluid loss. So you got to be careful of what you're drinking. Environmental factors can also affect hydration. So humidity causes you to sweat more often because your body's having a really hard time cooling down. So you produce a lot of sweat, but it's not evaporating. That's why you're producing a lot of sweat, because evaporation is slow because the air is already saturated. And so the sweat just drips away, doesn't do an effective job of cooling your blood. So when the blood returns back to the core, it's hot. So how your body cools is you'll pump blood out into the extremities. As sweat evaporates from your body, it'll cool that blood that's in the extremities, and then that cool blood comes back to the core, helps it cool down. Well, if you don't have adequate evaporation, that's not going to happen. In dry environments, the opposite happens, where your sweat evaporates so fast that you're just losing fluid, a lot of fluid, quickly. And you may not even notice it because it's evaporating so fast to that dry environment. Main types of heat illness: heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat stroke. And a lot of people get heat exhaustion, heat stroke confused. Heat cramps, we just need to replace the electrolytes. Same thing with heat exhaustion. That'll help out with the muscle spasms that occur in both of those. So heat exhaustion and heat stroke have very similar symptoms. So heat exhaustion, you may have profuse sweating, extreme thirst, flu-like symptoms, shortness of breath, fast heart rate. The only one of those that I just listed that you really won't have with heat stroke is sweating can stop. Doesn't always happen with heat stroke, but it can shut down and you're no longer sweating. That's one sign that you're having a heat stroke. Another sign is change in mental status. So the person starts to not make sense and they may not be sweating. Those are all signs of heat stroke. May be very hot to the touch, but they may feel cold. Like they may, even though their skin, like if we were to touch them, they may feel hot externally. They may feel as if they're getting cold. So you have two different types of heat stroke. You have classic heat stroke and exertional heat stroke. Classic heat stroke is like the slow cooker effect. That's what happens like up in Chicago. Like the individuals that aren't used to the high heat we get down here in the South, they may not have AC units, so it stays hot for several days, and then it just slowly builds up over time, and then they get heat stroke from it. Elderly people are exceptionally prone to this. Exertional heat stroke is like what athletes experience, or people that work outside, construction workers. They get out, they start doing too much in the heat, and their body just can't cool down fast enough. So classic, children and elderly are more prone, and just a slow rise in temperatures, and the victims can't adjust to it. Exertional, they're out there working. If anybody's suffering from heat stroke, if you suspect that, you need to call 911 as soon as possible. So care for heat cramps and heat exhaustion. And part of this will even connect to heat stroke, but move the victim out of the hot place, like get them into the shade as much as you can. Give them cool liquids. That'll help cool their core internally. Also, it'll help rehydrate them. Place ice bags if you have them, or cool pieces of cloth along the major arteries, so up underneath their armpits, up near their carotid arteries, up to the brain, because we're really worried about those organs getting cooked, especially the brain. And then if there's no change in the victim's condition within 30 minutes after trying to cool them down, if we're suspected heat exhaustion, they could be suffering from heat stroke. Let's call 911. In wilderness first aid, you may not be able to call 911, so you got to get them cool. So as long as they're not unconscious and there's a small stream that's shallow, you may have to submerge them in that stream, not with their head underwater, right? Just their body. Maybe slowly bring body parts over to it, or dip some cloth in that, especially if there's some cotton. If you can wet cotton and put it on them, that'll help cool them down. But it has to be a situation where there's no risk of their head going underneath the water. You're always in constant supervision of this person, and a situation where you could easily get them away from the water if possible. That's one way to cool them down if somebody's suffering from heat exhaustion in the wild. In the wild, let me just stress that. Care for heat stroke, same steps as we just listed above. If you have the ability to put them in a cool bath, what you don't want to do is put a bunch of ice in there and then drop them in there. It could put them into an arrhythmia, dropping them in extremely cold water. What you want to do is put them in a cool bath and slowly lower the temperature over time. And if you think it's heat stroke, call 911. Hypothermia, this is where somebody's getting too cold, and that can lead to organ failure or even death. And they may suffer where they're not making sense, they're having a hard time making decisions. So other signs are no shivering, altered mental state, like I just said, slower heart rate, and decreased breathing rate because you're getting too cold. Care for it. We try to warm them up. Get them into a sheltered location. If they have wet clothing, get that off and get them wrapped in something warm, but get them up off the ground because their body heat will never warm the ground. So we need a layer of some material between them and the ground, even if you just put down cedar boughs or pine boughs, like limbs, to elevate them. But we need some dead air space to get them warmed up. Cover them up as much as possible. If you have to, use your body heat to warm them up. If you have the ability to build a fire and boil some water, because then they can drink that warm liquid, and that'll help warm them up from the inside out. Just like drinking cool liquids helps somebody that's too hot. So survival rule of threes. What happens if somebody gets injured out in the wild and you cannot call or contact 911 or get somebody to come and help you to help out? Or you're going to be there for a long period of time even if you can contact somebody? So we need to think about shelter as soon as possible. So within the first 3 hours, if we know we're going to be there for a while, and we don't know what the weather conditions are going to be for the next couple of days, we need to get shelter as soon as possible. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you make. It could be a cave, it could be an overhang, it could be a fallen tree where part of your shelter is already built for you, depending on how big the tree is. The root ball of the tree could be one wall of a lean-to shelter where you turn it into an A-frame. A lot of different ways to get shelter. If you have to make one of the easiest ones is a lean-to, but it only provides you partial cover. And then fire/water. So the reason I combine those two is because if you make shelter, more than likely, unless you have a way of treating water, if you have a way of treating your water, it would go first over fire. But often in a survival situation, we're not prepared. So the fire allows you to boil your water. So if you know how to make fire primitively, you can make fire, boil your water. If the person's too cold, you can warm them up internally with externally with the fire, internally with the warm liquids they're drinking. If they're too hot, you can boil the water, let it cool down, but at least you know it's been treated and they're not going to get sick from it if you're going to be there for a while. So you can hydrate them with it. But you want it to cool down, so you may have to put the container back near the water to help cool it down. But don't let it get contaminated. And you can go a long time without food. So if you know you're not going to be out there for an extended period of time, food is not the biggest concern unless you're dealing with sudden illness like a diabetic emergency. Then it becomes a bigger issue. So we need to get some simple sugars in somebody. And more than likely in that situation, it's going to be hypoglycemia, not hyperglycemia. But it could happen. And with hyperglycemia, if they don't have insulin with them, there's really no viable way for us to reduce that blood sugar except not to let them eat anymore. All right, shelter. First 3 hours doesn't necessarily have to be something that you make. It can be ready-made. That's what I'm getting at, like with a overhang from a cave or a cave itself. But if you had to build one, brush shelters are good, simple shelters. Lean-tos are good because you can keep a fire fairly close to them. 2 lean-tos facing each other as an A-frame. That's even better because it provides you more protection. You can go on and on. This is not a wilderness survival class, so a shelter is your first concern within those first 3 hours, because if it starts to rain, even if you had a fire, it's going to put it out. And then if it starts to rain, you had no shelter, now you're going to get wet. You could get hypothermic. That's why shelter comes first. Fire would be good unless you have a way to treat water. Water is your priority to stay hydrated, and you can go a long time. Boiling the water allows you to kill pathogens that are in the water. So amoebas, bacteria, and viruses can be killed through boiling. And food, you can go a long time unless it's a diabetic emergency. Food is a major concern then. And then the skill, we're going to do soft splint ankle, as if somebody twisted their ankle on a trail, which is a common injury. Watch the video, it shows you how to do it. Go back to your lecture notes, answer those questions as you were watching the video, or go back and answer them if you've already watched the video and used the PowerPoints. And then if you're in the wild, you may not you still need to get consent, is what I'm trying to get at if you're in the wild. So get consent before giving care, check for circulation. Now, we're sandwiching the skills between checking for circulation. Here's why. You check for circulation before you put the splint on, because we're in a wilderness situation and we want to make sure we don't cut off blood supply, because they could lose that limb if that happens, if it's for a long enough period of time. So check for circulation first. Slide the bandages underneath the ankle first, then put the boot around it, then tie it off. Don't tie directly on the injured site, above and below it. And then check for circulation again. Because if they had circulation and then you put the splint on and now they don't have circulation, it's because of the splint. You may have to loosen some things up and change some things around and then re-tie it off. But this is only if you're going to move the victim do we apply the splint.